Members, if you could take your seats. Members, if you could take your seats, please. Thank you very much. I would like to welcome members of the jury and AFCO committees attending this hearing, along with the members of the ITRE and PETI committees who are associated with this hearing. And a very, very warm welcome to Maroš Šefčovič, Vice President Designate of the European Commission for Interinstitutional Relations and Foresight. The AFCO chair will be chairing the hearing with the chair of the jury committee. In line with the guidelines for the approval of the committee, Annex 7 to the Rules of Procedure, the purpose of this hearing is to evaluate the general competence, European commitment and personal independence of the Vice President designate, along with his knowledge of the prospective portfolio and his communication skills. I'd like to inform you that the debate will be live streamed on the Parliament's internet site, and also that it will be possible to access a video recording of the hearing on the same site. You will recall that after examining the declaration of financial interests of the Vice President designate, the Committee on Legal Affairs has raised no objection to the holding of this hearing. And I would like to inform the Vice President designate that he will be invited to make an opening oral statement of no longer than 15 minutes. The 25 questions will be divided into 5-minute slots and will be put during the hearing. One follow-up question will be asked immediately within the allocated time. And the 5-minute slots will be composed as followed: a 1-minute question by the member, a 2-minute answer from the Vice President designate, with the possibility of an immediate follow-up question from the same member of 1 minute, and a 1-minute answer by the Vice President designate.
Buon pomeriggio a tutti.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to remind the members of the AFCO and jury committees that you have all received the curriculum vitae of Vice President Šefčovič, and you've also been sent a copy of the answers to the written questions that were sent to him. I'd also like to remind Vice President Šefčovič, who isn't here for the first time, I must say it's the third time, that the hearing is scheduled for 3 hours, in other words, until 5:30 p.m. I'm very pleased as chairman of AFCO and also as former president of the European Parliament that the portfolio of Vice President Šefčovič covers the Commission's follow-up to Parliament's requests for legislative initiatives. Vice President, so I'm asking you formally for this, and of course you were also in the Barroso Commission, and you were already responsible for relations with the European Parliament. And you did this very well, but we would like to ask you for your formal commitment to this so that the European Parliament can have these full powers. In other words, to have a parliament that has the right of legislative initiative. Of course, this means that the commitment of President von der Leyen will become a reality, and I know that you are committed to this as well. This should be a priority. If we want to reduce the gap between citizens and the European Parliament, then the European Parliament cannot be a half-class institution. You are also aware of the fact that we're committed to the right of inquiry of the European Parliament. This is no easy battle, but the European Parliament feels that this is another important priority. In the past, when you were responsible for interinstitutional relations, you worked hard on this, and I'm sure that once again you will make sure that the European Parliament is at the heart of this whole process. This is about strengthening democracy in Europe. It's about reducing the gap that still exists between the institutions and European citizens. But it's also about positive relations between the European Commission and the European Parliament. And I think that by strengthening this, we'll be able to give out a positive message. Often institutions close in on themselves because of excessive bureaucracy. And so I think that on the contrary, we need to make sure that all the political institutions, the Council, the Commission and the European Parliament can get down to work very quickly. And a lot hinges on the work that you will do and on how the European Commission will work with the European Parliament. I'd also like to say to Vice President Šefčovič and to all colleagues that unlike what I did when I was president, where I was quite flexible when it came to speaking time, in this particular instance, I won't be able to be flexible. As Chair Nethsinga said, questions 1 minute, answers 1 minute, then the same MEP has the right to have a follow-up question only if he or she needs clarifications, not on another issue, and then we get a quick reply from Mr. Šefčovič. Now, and then we'll have this face-to-face and this ping-pong of questions after Vice President Šefčovič takes the floor. You have the floor for 15 minutes, sir.
Dear President Nethsinga, dear President Tajani, honorable chairs, honorable members of the European Parliament, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a great honor for me to appear before you as a Commissioner designate. It's also a privilege to open these upcoming days of debate and scrutiny displaying the European democracy at its best. There is also an emotional element to it. In a few weeks, we will celebrate 30 years of freedom in my country, Slovakia, following the Velvet Revolution. And I recall very well looking through the infamous Iron Curtain, through the barbed wire across the Danube, not knowing if I ever would be able to cross the river, visit our Austrian neighbors, or even, as it is chance today, to work for United Europe. This experience has contributed to my firm conviction that we must build our destiny as a democratic union, and to my strong respect for our common institutions and values. It's even more apparent today, as the world is changing at unprecedented pace. Humanity's ecological footprint has led to the global climate emergency. The global race for technological leadership is set to transform our economic models as well as societies. The multilateral, rules-based order that Europe stands for is under pressure. And the age of disinformation, combined with persisting inequalities, put a strain on our democracy. We face a crucial question. How can the European Union ensure that we do not end up a middle power caught between the United States and China? Honourable members, to address these challenges, I am convinced that we need more, not less Europe, and a stronger European Parliament. Article 10 of the Treaty on the European Union says that our functioning shall be founded on representative democracy. And this is ever more important. Therefore, I am truly honoured that President-elect wants to entrust me with both interinstitutional relations and foresight. The European Commission and the European Parliament are natural partners. We have built solid foundations over the years. However, it will be my priority to take our cooperation a step further into a special partnership based on trust amongst ourselves as well as with our citizens. In particular, I will propose that our partnership extends beyond the legislative domain. It should apply more fully throughout the whole political cycle. Evidence gathering and foresight to jointly shape the direction of Europe, a shared priority and agenda setting, a new right of initiative, which I know is very important for you, and a better implementation, including through cutting red tape. We simply cannot continue acting in crisis management mode with predominantly intergovernmental approach. A stronger parliament means a stronger and more legitimate Europe. A stronger parliament also means moving into a shared culture of anticipation and action to be resilient in the long run. So let me now turn to concrete measures, how to build this special relationship. First, I foresee close-knit cooperation between our institutions in agenda-setting stage. As you know, I should support President-elect by developing the Commission work programme. This will be a matter of priority, as our first programme must be agreed already in December. From day one, I will therefore work with my colleagues in the Commission as well as reach out to you, to political groups and to the Conference of Committee Chairs in the Parliament. On this basis, we should also adopt a joint declaration on legislative priorities between our three institutions. I will also propose to adopt first ever multi-annual programme as foreseen in 2016 interinstitutional agreement on better lawmaking. And this programme needs to be also a co-creation exercise with a collective ownership and accountability. It also needs to be grounded in the foresight work at interinstitutional level. Second, a right of initiative for the European Parliament that would mark the start of a new institutional era. As announced by President-elect, when the Parliament, acting by a majority of its members, requests a legislative proposal, the Commission will respond with a legislative act in full respect of the proportionality, subsidiarity and better lawmaking principles. To deliver swiftly, I will propose that our institutions engage in earliest phases of conception of parliamentary resolutions and work hand in hand at every stage in designing them. I want to put in place an early warning mechanism to ensure constant dialogue between the Commission and the Parliament. Once a parliamentary resolution is adopted, I will ensure that the College of Commissioners holds a political discussion on the subject. And such a process should facilitate understanding on substance and at the same time foster trust between our two institutions and a sense of working together towards a common goal. It is in this House where the heart of European democracy beats. I will therefore work with the Vice President in charge to ensure the Parliament plays an active role in the Conference on the Future of Europe. And third, I will encourage to revive discussions on pending institutional files, in particular on the right of inquiry. I have full understanding for the Parliament's attempt to review the regulation. As the discussion has been stalled over the institutional and legal concerns, I stand ready to engage in trilateral discussions. Regarding international negotiations, I will work with the relevant commissioners to ensure that the European Parliament is regularly briefed, notably before major events and at key stages of international negotiations. And fourth, petitions. As input from the citizens to detect and, where appropriate, to act upon breaches of EU law. I will work closely with the Petitions Committee throughout the year and, of course, attend its presentation of the annual report. Moreover, should we see significant number of petitions on one topic, I will encourage presence of responsible commissioners to discuss what can be done to remedy the concerns expressed. And finally, I want to work with you on better regulation and its effective and transparent implementation. Our objective should be to adopt and implement future-proof legislation that can stand the test of time, which does not create unnecessary burden and delivers results at minimum cost. To this end, I want to advance the better regulation agenda further. I will propose that the REFIT platform is rebranded to a Fit for the Future platform. I am convinced that our legislation should be, for instance, fit for e-government and digital use. Regularly, I will report to the Parliament on the platform's findings. I also believe that we should better involve those on the receiving end of the regulation and to go more for active subsidiarity in order to do away with that common impression that everything is decided in Brussels. We will strengthen the means by which local and regional authorities can inform us of the burden experienced when applying EU legislation, as well as of opportunities to alleviate it. An input from you, honourable members, will be equally valuable because you interact on the ground in your constituencies. I will surely involve in this work the Committee of the Regions and the European Economic and Social Committee. I also aim to engage more actively with the Member States to ensure that when transposing EU legislation, they do not add unnecessary administrative burden. We all know it under the name gold plating. The EU institutions should be warned when a Member State introduces measures going beyond EU legislation requirements. And I will involve the Commission representations in this, and I will make sure that the members of the European Parliament are properly informed as well. In the first 2 years of the mandate, I plan to visit all national parliaments to better value the important work in relation to active subsidiarity and proportionality, and I will discuss with them our multi-annual programming. I will apply the one in, one out principle as announced by President-elect, meaning that every legislative proposal with a new burden for the users should be offset by an equivalent reduction elsewhere. This is particularly key for small and medium enterprises, and I will make sure that this new principle is applied in all areas. However, and I would like to underline this, I say a clear no to a mechanical approach and to endangering our high standards, especially social and environmental. Actually, we should always weigh benefits as well. The European Parliament has done an excellent work with its study on the cost of non-Europe, quantifying economic gain of 2.2 trillion euros over the 10 years if, for instance, we implement fully our single market, notably in the services, digital, energy, and if we address corporate tax avoidance. Therefore, via citizen summary, I want us to communicate better the evidence-based benefits for citizens, businesses, and societies as such. Our success on interinstitutional front is a prerequisite for embedding foresight into the policy making. Linking the two domains can be a true game changer. This is not something abstract, and I can give you a vibrant example, the European Battery Alliance. Even if at 12th hour we had anticipated the upcoming tectonic shift towards e-mobility. With the industry leading, we started to act strategically to build a strong value chain and start producing the greenest batteries here in Europe. And as a result, we are catching up with our Asian competitors, and the sustainable future for our automotive industry seems secure. I'm honored that the President-elect has entrusted me with continuing to lead our efforts in this area, and I'm also ready to discuss other strategic sectors where Europe can make a real difference, provided that we all work together. To this end, if confirmed by you, I will propose that we strive for world-class anticipatory governance, building foresight capacity inside the Commission to serve our policy goals. And my intention is to mobilize resources of the Joint Research Centre as a crucial enabler. We need to set up an EU network of strategic foresight, bringing together the best of EU institutions and the Member States. As the saying goes, you are entitled to your own opinion, but not to your own facts. So faced with a tsunami of information, I also want to safeguard the quality of evidence and to reinforce its transparency. In practice, I will explore with the other institutions the setting up of a common evidence register open to public, where we will share the evidence used in our legislative proposals. As you know, President-elect's mission letter gives me a mandate to prepare a yearly foresight report on the most relevant emerging trends. This report will inform the State of the Union speech and our programming exercise. Based on it, I will champion strategic debates in the European Parliament as well as the European Council. And I want us to agree on transformative megatrends that we need to approach strategically and develop our long-term vision for Europe with a direct impact on multi-annual programming as well. With this in mind, I will work closely with the Vice President for the Conference on the Future of Europe. Monsieur le Président, Madame la Présidente, Mesdames,
Mr. President, Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, I've had the privilege to work with parliamentarians of this House during the last legislatures. Let me first of all say that I primarily work with the Constitutional Affairs Committee and the Legal Affairs Committee, also with the Industry, Research and Energy Committee to put together the Energy Union. We entered into a framework agreement between our institutions. We worked hand in hand to bring about modernization of the statute for officials and other servants. I was also able to play my modest part in achieving these objectives. And what I want to do is to work without stint to achieve a good outcome for our partnership. I have my convictions and my democratic principles inherited from the Velvet Revolution. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much.
Van harte bedankt, meneer Šefčovič. We gaan van start met de coördinatoren van de politieke fracties. Eerste vraag komt van meneer Vos, EVP-coördinator in de Jury-commissie.
Thank you, Chair.
Dank, voorzitter. Van harte welkom in het Europees Parlement, meneer Šefčovič. Het is voor mij een eer om als eerste het woord te krijgen tijdens deze vragenronde. U wil wat doen aan administratieve overlast voor burgers en bedrijven en daarom zal u een nieuw instrument ontwikkelen. Met een one-in, one-out principe. Hoe zal u dat doen op Europees niveau? Hoe zal u samenwerken met de lidstaten wanneer het gaat om de omzetting van de Europese wetgeving om een dergelijk principe ook toe te passen en te vermijden dat er sprake is van onnodige administratieve overlast? Wanneer kunnen we dat instrument verwachten? Meneer Šefčovič, van harte bedankt. Bedankt voor uw vraag, meneer Vos. Allereerst denk ik dat we ons hier goed moeten concentreren. Iedereen heeft wel eens een burger ontmoet die niet tevreden was over een bedrijf. Zij waren voorstanders van het Verenigd Europa, maar ze zijn bang om onze instrumenten te gebruiken of een aanvraag in te dienen voor een subsidie, omdat ze zien dat de administratieve overlast overdreven is. De nieuwe voorzitter wil inspanningen leveren om te
burden. But as I say, for me, it's quite clear that under no way we should apply this principle mechanically, and under no way we should risk our high standards in the area of social affairs or environment. So how I would like to do it? At first, I am going to rebrand the REFIT program to the Fit for the Future, where I also would discuss widely with you, because I think that the traditional assessment of how the legislation is working, I mean, it needs also an upgrade. Is it digital enough? Is it compatible with the e-government? Does it have this things small first approach? Is the burden which is in the legislation problem of the EU legislation, or is it transposition, or very often sometimes the last table, the last annex at the end of the legislation which we would need to change? So I would like to have a more comprehensive approach where we would make sure that even when we adopt a new legislation which we need, we would always think, what can we do and how can we focus our minds and introduce this discipline across our institutions that would always bear in mind the need and necessity also to reduce administrative burden elsewhere. Thank you.
Are you satisfied? Yes. Okay, the second question is by Mr. Pedro Silva Pereira from SD, in name of FSND in AFCO. You have the floor.
Obrigado, Sr. Presidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. Vice Chairs and, of course, Mr. Šefčovič, welcome here. Welcome to the Parliament. I mean, we know each other fairly well because you've been a commissioner on the 2009 Commission. and you were already therefore active in institutional relations in your previous mandate, so we have reasons to be very optimistic about your appointment. To increase the democratic workings of the European Union, the European Parliament must be given a greater role. So my question is, what do you see the role of this Parliament being in shaping the future of Europe? You said that the Parliament would be actively involved in the upcoming conference. So my question is, will the Parliament be taking a leadership role, or will it be taking a supporting role, or even that of a highly honoured guest? So what is your opinion of interinstitutional treaties, particularly on economic policy areas and the European semester?
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I also would like to appreciate the question from my colleague, from the Honourable Member Pereira. At first, I would like to underline how important it is that these two communitarian institutions, the European Parliament and Commission, would not only deliver on this special partnership, but also would work even more strategically on our common future. I think that the European Parliament would be the right place to discuss the future of Europe even beyond our legislature. I am absolutely convinced that what we decide in the next 5 years would really shape the position of Europe for years to come. If I have to be a little bit over-dramatic, I can say that we are going to decide the fate of Europe in this century. So therefore, what we adopt here would have dramatic implication on the place of Europe in the world. Therefore, this Commission has to be geopolitical, and therefore we have to have this strategic debates on the future, on all key megatrends here in European Parliament. Coming closer to what is our daily routine, if it comes to the conference on the future of Europe, here clearly we have to work on it together. And President-elect was very clear that she is absolutely ready to be in close cooperation with the European Parliament, and she is ready to accept that the European Parliament and the member of the European Parliament would lead this conference. I think what also she was underlying was the fact that we need to get this conference also a little bit outside of Brussels, that we need to talk to our citizens, I would say even outside of the capitals, to talk to them more concretely in their regions, to see that we really know about their concerns. And if it comes to interinstitutional relations, if you give me another chance in subsequent questions, I will come to that in a second.
Are you satisfied?
Eu penso que ainda há tempo disponível.
Well, if there's time, do we still have time? Okay, well then I would like to take the opportunity of asking a follow-up question. Could you talk more about the implementation of interinstitutional agreements? You're very familiar with them because you negotiated on the 2010 Framework Agreement. And that is intended to deepen relations between the Parliament and Commission.
You're absolutely right. I still remember very dynamic negotiations we had in 2009, and I'm glad that the framework agreement withstood the test of time. But I remember that already at that time, we've been trying to do our utmost to make sure that Council will also be part of this framework agreement, because the primary purpose of this framework agreement was that we've been Lisbonizing our common relationship. And therefore, I think that if I get your approval, what I will do would be to approach the Council again. Here we have a framework agreement. Let's look at it, what is valid, what needs to be updated, and how can we get the Council closer, cooperate with us, also on the basis of this agreement. We managed to do that in better lawmaking agreement, and therefore I believe that we should be able to achieve it also in the framework agreement as well.
Thank you very much. The third is the coordinator on URI, the Renew Europe, Karen Melchior. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for Commissioner-designate for being here. I liked your initial statement about having future-proof legislation based on evidence and using the Joint Research Centre as a crucial enabler. The Commission's approach towards better regulation, however, has been criticised for not taking into account the Commission's own impact assessments or expert evidence, and cherry-picking of evidence by not publishing reports contrary to a political line of the Commission. This includes evidence produced on behalf of the Commission. In a concrete case, the former Commission withheld expert analysis by the Joint Research Centre and refused to take into account statements from academics. How will you, as a Commissioner, make sure that all expert evidence and impact assessments are published in the evidence register that you mentioned and are included in the proposals? Thank you.
Mr. Šefčovič.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam, for the question, and also I very much appreciated the experience with how the EU legislation is implemented and can be modernized, which been so generously provided to the Commission by the Danish business associations. I think that when we are talking about the future-proof legislation, I think that what is absolutely key today is that it will be digitally up to the demand of the time, that we would try to avoid, for example, reference to the fax, because I was very much surprised when the young people have been asking me, what kind of machine is fax? And we still have it in some of our legislation. So it has to be compatible with e-government. It has to be digitally up to date, and if it's not, we simply have to upgrade it. If it comes to the impact assessment and evidence-based legislation, I think here we have to really open a new chapter. I have to admit that I personally was surprised how big is the wealth of information we already have in our institutions, be it Joint Research Centre, but also several units at DG RTD, or your work in European Parliament, where your units and your experts are ready and prepared to put together such excellent reports on the cost of non-Europe, about which very often we don't speak long enough. And I honestly think that it would be pity if we would just hide that information or just keep it for ourselves. So my idea would be to really set up interinstitutional evidence-based register where we would put all that good work by our scientists, by our experts, which was done. It would be, of course, under your control. It would be interinstitutional. And I believe that all these studies and evidence-based reports would help us to make better, more future-oriented legislation.
Are you satisfied?
Thank you very much for your reply. I'm very much looking forward to having a more open and transparent register of evidence, and also happy to hear that we'll have legislation or regulation that will be more future-proof in terms of digitalization and digital means of communication. There is also the question of the involvement of citizens as a foundation of better regulation, and their influence on this regulation is key to our democracy. However, in a recent case as well, citizens had directly voiced their concern for specific issues of Commission proposals and felt that their points of view were disregarded, and even that the Commission itself described this opposition as being a mob in blogs and indicated that they were bots. How do you see that the new future-proof and evidence-based process will better include citizens' voices? Thank you.
I think it's very relevant questions, and I think that we'll have to go deeper into assessment, what we can do even better with your committee, and also with all approach and relationship between the Commission, URI, and petty committees as well. I understand that very often the citizens are somehow discouraged to participate in the public consultations, because if you look at our Have Your Say website, I mean, it's very well done, but there are quite a few consultations which might be quite confusing for the citizens. I think that if we want to have more participation and better quality from our citizens, what we need to do is to make much more publicity to these consultations, and not only speak about it from Brussels, but talk through professional associations, use our commissions or parliamentary representations in our capitals and have more targeted discussions where the citizens would know that we want to know the answer. And what is even more important, they need a response from us. So they need to see that somebody is reading their suggestion, is evaluating them, and is really appreciating that they send it to us.
The next question is by the coordinator of the Greens in AFCO committee, Mr. Daniel Freund. You have the floor.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much, Mr. Šefčovič, for answering our questions today. In the mission letters by your colleagues, I was doing some counting, and there were 97 proposals for new pieces of legislation. And with this one in, one out principle, you are supposed to be reducing bureaucracy. So could I ask you whether you have a list of which of the 97 old pieces of legislation that you will get rid of under Mrs. von der Leyen? So within the first 100 days, we've got the major climate package. I wonder whether we would need to worry. What about roaming fees being reintroduced? If we're going to get rid of bureaucracy and we're going to take it seriously, then it's not just a question of the numbers of pieces of legislation, but what citizens and companies are upset about is the fact that you might have a small Erasmus grant, but you have ever longer forms to fill in. So rather than asking for laws to be deleted, maybe it's a question of concentrating on what people are feeling, maybe making the forms shorter rather than trying to undermine social or environmental standards.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your question and also for your very strong statement with which I agree. So I really would like to reassure the honourable members of this House, but also the public, that they shouldn't worry about all the high standards we built for getting rid of roaming or all the social environmental standards. We are doing our utmost to constantly improve. What the President-elect wanted to achieve with this approach, one in, one out, was, I would say, the new discipline, how we look at administrative burden. So if we are bringing something in, we should just really measure how much more burdensome this would be for, let's say, small and medium-sized enterprises, for businesses or for the citizens, and look where in our books we have a legislation which is already outdated or which still uses the fax, or where we want them to fill up some paper forms, and if we cannot do it better, faster, more up-to-date, and in a way which would be much more user-friendly than it is right now. You're absolutely right. We have very ambitious agenda for the first 100 days. We want to deliver on Green Deal. We want to deliver on a minimum wage. We want to deliver on pay transparency. And we also want to bring also the new rules how to develop artificial intelligence in Europe. But at the same time, I also want to assure you that we will approach all the tackling of the administrative burden with utmost care, with sensitivity, and really having it as a top priority, that in no way we are going to cut our standards. As you know, we have also to adopt the decision on all the pending files which are on the Commission tables. To be quite honest, I didn't have a chance to go through it yet. It's more than 100. We'll have to sit on it as a college to just have a look if we need it all or if some amendments there could be made. But you will be properly briefed and informed. Thank you.
Are you satisfied?
Ich würde gerne noch mal nachfragen.
Could I just ask, you keep talking about evidence-based policy and facts. If I understand it correctly, then the Commission policy is going to be basing itself on scientific bases. And we've got 26,000 scientists in Europe saying that current climate policy is not helping the situation with regard to the climate in Europe at the moment. So how are you going to ensure that the 1,033 legal acts that the European Union has passed since 1999 will, over the next 5 years, be checked to make sure that they're in line with the Paris agreement. And all the new pieces of legislation would also have to fit in with that. So that needs to be translated into the languages of the Commission. And we would also need to make sure that the impact assessment approach is changed very fundamentally to keep our climate targets, rather than at the end of the legislation finding that we have missed the 1.5 degree target.
Thank you very much for your question as well. And here, I think that the discussion which is currently taking place in the European Parliament is also very reflected in the reflection how to improve the impact assessments also in the Commission. It's quite clear that we would need to enlarge it and even more take into account scientific evidence if what we do to tackle climate change is enough, if the social impacts are properly measured, if the new legislation is really there for in a position to withstand the pressure of the time and this constant change. So we will have to bring a lot of new elements in to modernize the impact assessments, and therefore we would like to combine it as much as possible with a foresight which would give us the possibility to look how we would like to see Europe in 10, 20 years. And then, of course, what is, I think, very important for all of us in the European Parliament, to be very honest, transparent, and publish all the evidence and all impact assessments in this joint register.
Merci beaucoup. Le prochain.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Jérôme Rivière on behalf of ID and representing both Jury and AFCO. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Šefčovič. Now, it's as an MEP representing the Identity and Democracy group that I asked this question. I really want to emphasize this because my group hasn't been treated very well in the European Parliament. So we're applying the D'Hondt rule here because it was systematically refused for my colleagues, and we're not allowed to take part in certain institutions. Now, as Vice President responsible for interinstitutional relations, what are you going to do to make sure that you're listening to the voice of those who voted for us? Because we got many votes. Now, science is calling into question some of the founding principles of our society. So what kind of consultations that respect the people are you thinking of coming up with to evaluate whether technology or other practice making sure that we're on the right path so we can guarantee individual and collective rights?
Thank you very much for your question. As you know, the role of the Commission is to be the guardian of the treaties and is to be also a close partner of the European Parliament. And I can reassure you that we are ready to work very closely with the European Parliament and with all the good suggestions, good advice, which would serve the European general interest and would have this strong pro-European vocation. So if this is the basis, I'm sure that we would look for the ways how we can cooperate with all groups in the European Parliament. If it comes to the quality of the public consultations, I think that we would need to develop also the new methods. I was talking about the public consultations and the different levels of the response we get. When we've been discussing about something which was very close to the citizens' heart, like summertime, we had 4.6 million people writing to us that they would like to get rid of that system. On other consultations, we get less enthusiasm and less responses. And I think that's because the people are simply not that well informed that something like this we are proposing and preparing. Therefore, we will need to take out the public consultations much more to our countries, to our regions, talk to professional associations to make sure that we will have the better response in the future. And if it comes to the future technologies, I think the first test will be with us very, very shortly. And this would be artificial intelligence. How we are going to make sure that we would respect our European values. How we would make sure that the GDPR top-level of the protection of privacy of personal data would be translated also to the new digital technologies. How to make sure that machines will be there for us and not us there for the machines. Thank you.
Est-ce que vous êtes satisfait?
Are you satisfied with the answer, or do you want to ask a follow-up? Now, on respecting parliaments, what is your position on a red card procedure that would mean that we respect the subsidiarity rules? So if a majority of national parliaments refuse a proposal from the European Commission or the European Parliament, what do you think about this kind of veto that would stop us in our tracks, and so that this respects national sovereignty and national parliaments? Thank you.
Here again, I would be very, very practical, because I'm talking very often to the national parliaments, and I know how important for them the yellow, orange cards are, and the discussions on green card and the red cards are very pertinent and very present in our debates as well. And what I am explaining to our colleagues, and I'm ready to work on it even more in the political sense. Once we in the Commission see that the proposal we might table would face the opposition of more than 50% of the national parliaments, we are not even going to put it on the table. We are very realistic that if you have oppositions of more than half of the national parliaments, that you will not get this approved. At the same time, we have also good examples for the green card. When we got the letters from many national parliaments that we should deal better with the food waste, we acted and we introduced this particular element into our circular economy proposals, and I think many national parliaments have been quite pleased how quickly we reacted to that matter. So let's use our political tools to make sure that we work closer with the with the national parliaments.
The next speaker is Mr. Angel Zambaski from ECR Group in Jure Committee. You have the floor.
Thank you, President. Commissioner Designate, I wish to congratulate you for the work so far, and I wish you success. Let me pick up from what my predecessor said. You will be responsible for relations with national parliaments and will be responsible for observing the proportionality and subsidiarity and the links between the people who serve them. I'm sure you are familiar with the report on the working group on subsidiarity and proportionality and are familiar with the specific recommendations on strengthening the role of national parliaments. What specifically are you going to do? More specifically, the orange card and the yellow card. And what are you going to do about the principle one in, one out? The proposal for a new regulatory act to be accompanied by a proposal to revoke one act. Does the Commission plan a stronger role on the stakeholder, for instance, businesses and citizens? Thank you very much.
Mr. Šefčovič, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Honourable Member, for your question. If it comes to the conclusions of that advisory board, I read them very, very carefully, and I think that one particular idea clearly deserves the development, and this is the concept of active subsidiarity. I think that we should look for the ways how we can consult or bring into our European debates national parliaments, regional authorities, or if there are regional parliaments, earlier on, so they can feel that they are part of this European endeavor, and also they can already at that time voice their concern about, I don't know, administrative burden or the problems with applicability in the concrete countries or the region. I think that that would really help us a lot in making sure that our legislation is really future-proof and much more widely accepted, and what is even more important, properly transposed, because a lot of problems we have with bureaucracy is going through the gold plating when or national or regional parliaments are adding to the transposed European legislation some national regional elements which then make the execution or implementation of the European law extremely complicated. I very much appreciate the work which was done on this matter also by the Committee of Regions, the development of RegHub, which is actually the network of regional authorities to make sure that they will inform us on time where the problems are and how they could be remedied, is something what we have to work on, and we should clearly develop it on the future. And if it comes to the wider consultations, I think that to consult social partners, to consult professional associations is always very helpful, because you learn a lot and you make sure that what we are working on will be properly understood and well implemented.
Are you satisfied? Okay, thank you. And now, for the GROW Group, Mr. Helmut Scholz from AFCO, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Šefčovič. Coming back to your keywords of initiative and competence, again, I'm going to ask some very specific questions. On that conference on the future of Europe, you said that Parliament will also be given initiative on, say, framework and initiative and developing projects. How will you ensure that European citizens will be involved actively and will be able to participate in that conference and have the right to set and shape the agenda, to speak and shape the EU's priorities?
Thank you very much, Mr. Scholz. This is a very relevant question, because if you want to succeed with the conference on the future of Europe, we clearly have to bring it closer to our citizens. And as I was referring to it a few minutes earlier, not only have this debate here in Brussels or Strasbourg or in our capitals, but really to go out to the regions and talk directly with our citizens. I have quite a lot of experience with the citizens' dialogue, and I was just looking through some figures in preparation of today's hearing, and I was quite impressed. And since we started with the citizens' dialogue, we managed to talk personally, all commissioners, to 200,000 citizens. So it works. We know how to reach them, but also the lessons learned from that experience was that we need to bring to the discussions the topics which are relevant for our people. It might be a specific regional questions, or it might be linked to the concrete industry, which is very important in that region, or it might be a question which is important for youth, which is looking what to study to make sure that they will be good contribution to the society, and they will be well prepared for this ever more dynamic labor market. And I also learned that if you want to have a good debate, it helps if you have on the podium together with you somebody who is very respected locally. Some of you, colleagues, members of the European Parliament, been in the citizens' dialogue with me. It was always excellent and very helpful. Other time it was a mayor, it was a local minister, and I think that what we have to do is really to prepare and model these discussions with the citizens, which would be really wide, which would go across the Europe, where we would like to address as many citizens as possible with the topics which they are interested in. And of course, your advice and experience with your constituencies would be very, very valuable.
Thank you. Are you satisfied? Okay.
Nochmal nachgehakt.
Well, just a follow-up. Who is driving this development? Do you think that the European Parliament has got the right to take the initiative? You know, to shape the agenda together with the Commission, and hopefully also jointly with the Council? And then that one in, one out principle you suggested, isn't that a contradiction with that? Shouldn't we introduce Think Sustainable first?
On the first question, you know that if it comes to the Commission, we always like to have a right of initiative. But of course, here we are talking about the interaction with our citizens where you are directly elected representatives of our citizens. So I'm sure that also in this case, this would be the co-creation exercise. My colleague, Vice President responsible for preparing the Conference on Future of Europe, I'm sure will very intensely consult the European Parliament. I'll be very happy to be the part of that exercise, to bring my part of the expertise which we are building right now to discuss about long-term planning, about foresight and the new emerging trends. So I'm sure that this would be a co-creation exercise where we will find a model which will bring the good topics to the discussion and which would increase the interest of our citizens to debate and discuss Europe. And if it comes to your second question, of course, sustainability must be part of every impact assessment and of every move we will do in the field of legislation.
Thank you very much. Now we start with the second round with the questions of the members of the different committees. We start with Mr. Bilčík from AFCO EPP. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. Dear Vice President Designate, dear colleagues, as members of this Parliament, we represent the voice of Europe's citizens, and therefore, in addition to issues of competence, we must also question the personal and political readiness of future potential commissioners. In particular, let me raise two questions on the relationship between words and deeds in the Vice President Designate's past actions. And for the sake of clarity, do let me continue this exchange directly in the Slovak language. Vážený pán podpredseda, vo vašom...
So in your commission letter, it says that and I'm quoting now, a balanced college will make better use of the potential. And that's a good start, but there's a lot that we need to do still. In the past, you have repeatedly said that we need to do all we can to prevent various forms of discrimination, including gender-based violence. And in March this year, you welcomed the Slovak government's Council of Europe agreement to ban gender-based violence.
President, if you allow, I will answer my compatriot in our mother tongue, so also our people in Slovakia would better understand this exchange on this Slovak item raised by the honourable member. So
I must say that the question that you've asked me is one that affects me very closely, and in two ways. Firstly, I'm a father of two daughters, and it's so unpleasant for me personally to see how my two daughters have worse prospects in life than my son by the very virtue of being born girls. And my words affirmed my aim across my whole life. When I was the Human Resources Commissioner, I followed that up too, when it was my absolute interest to make sure that we as a European administration set a positive example. So how we could ensure positive examples of parental leave, how we could, despite a serious financial crisis, despite that we should do our utmost to set up two new European schools. That's two examples, or indeed how we could introduce parental benefits for same-sex couples. There are many more examples I could name, including the fact that I was the first to set very important and ambitious targets to increase the number of women in leadership positions in the European Commission. And when it comes to violence, gender-based violence, then I can say very clearly that I am 100% behind Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen, the President-elect, and I'll do everything I can to support her in her endeavour to get gender-based violence recognised as a European crime which should be written down in the European Register of such offences.
Are you satisfied?
Yes, thank you very much. Just one more question, Vice President. On your declaration of interests, and your past activities. Your mission letter says that we need to have ethics and transparency as much as possible. Well, sticking to that is, of course, important for a commissioner's portfolio for fact-based and clear, transparent communication policy. And against that background, I was disconcerted to see that the communication channels you have used in your political work in Slovakia. So you didn't give interviews, for example, in Slovakia this year. And can you assure us that you will give equal access to independent media in Slovakia? Thank you.
I will continue
yes,
in my mother tongue. Pán kolega.
Oh, so a few minutes ago in your opening question, you stressed how important it is for me to stick to all the values I have committed to. And I also said how important it is to stick to the values of the Velvet Revolution. I've been committed to those values all my life. And you won't find any independent media organisation, be it in Slovakia, here, or in Europe, or across the world, which I have refused to engage with. Now, if you have some kind of information, then I'll be very, very pleased to communicate my press activities to you, to disabuse you of your illusions. It is not only the case that, in fact, I do communicate with all journalists who are interested in communicating with me. Not only do I do that, but whenever I appear in public, I have always argued in favour of European positions, because it is important for us as Slovaks to be a strong force in a united Europe. And in that spirit, I will continue to work in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Timo Völken from ECD. Jure Committee. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Šefčovič. Let me start perhaps by thanking you for the fact that you've taken the initiative Right for Parliament seriously and want to strengthen it, taking into account, of course, that it needs to be implemented, and then also the one in, one out principle. I think we've noticed here that this is met with some degree of rejection. It's not a question of pure mathematics, and the European Union isn't one of those clubs where you have one person let out to let a new person in, and this isn't a game that we should get dragged into. If we want to have a better law-making agreement looked at more closely, then I think the focus would need to be on transparency. It's about transparency for citizens, as it says in the introductory section. And if you cannot persuade Mrs. von der Leyen that the one in, one out principle isn't required, I wonder how you're going to guarantee that Parliament is able to provide transparency for citizens so that they can really see which laws are going to be annulled so that a new one can come in.
Thank you very much for this question, because you're absolutely right. It's very relevant not only for you, but for the wider public. And once again, I would like to reiterate my commitment that we will be approaching the cutting of the red tape with all the vigor, but with all the care at the same time. And I can reassure you that if we would come up with any proposals, how we can simplify, how we can reduce the administrative burden, that we will, of course, consult you. You are co-legislator. We cannot do it on our own. You have to be our partner in this respect. And I believe, as I already noticed in my preparatory meetings with many of you, that you have a lot of excellent ideas how we can do it, because you have the experience on the ground. And I think that to introduce this discipline, that we would look at any new legislation through this second pair of eyes, how we can not only adopt something which Europe needs, but also to open the avenue for reflection what else we could do that the people would not have a feeling that even though the legislation is important, it kind of makes it too difficult for that particular sector. And what I'm particularly looking at is how we can make the legislation more user-friendly. How can we make it more digital? And maybe we can also learn a little bit from the sector of IT, where the developer of applications in our smartphones are simply testing the application listening to the feedback from the users, and if they see that something is not working properly, they're trying to correct it. I think it's a time that we do the same. If we see that we adopted something which is cumbersome, which is difficult, and for which we have a lot of complaints, let's not pretend that this was the best thing in the world we have done, but let's be humble and say, yeah, maybe we didn't get it right in the first place. Let's correct it. Let's be much more, I would say, faster in making sure that our legislation is up to date, modern, and not cumbersome. Thank you.
Do you want to react? Please. That's okay. Maintenant pour le groupe.
On behalf of Renew Europe, Mr. Pascal Durand from AFCO. You have the floor, sir. Thank you very much, Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Šefčovič. Earlier on, you talked about a register that will allow us to have a little bit more information on impact assessments and so on. Democracy is grappling with a new difficulty, and that is that we have more and more cutting-edge expertise, and we've had a lot of scandals, Dieselgate, for example, glyphosate, assessments there. In your potential portfolio, I'm not asking you to deal with everything in one go, but how do you envisage that expertise, comitology, delegated acts, everything that delegates democracy to a set of experts will no longer be riddled with the difficulties we've had, in other words, private interests, public interests, stakes. So how are you going to put EU independence at the heart of this? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I also would like to appreciate how you put all my future tasks in that very vivid perspective, and thank you very much for that. At least we know how much is ahead of us, because I'm 100% sure that this would be our common effort and our common work. As you know, a lot has been done since the Lisbon Treaty were adopted, and let's be honest, we are still struggling how to make sure that we will properly use the delegated implementing acts and how to involve the Parliament to its satisfaction that you would have a full right of scrutinies. If it comes to the expert groups, especially if it comes to the delegated act, I think there we managed to fix it, that now the experts of the European Parliament have full access to the expert groups preparing the delegated acts, and I know that how difficult negotiations we had on that 10 years ago. The same goes if we are talking about preparatory expert groups for implementing acts, where the experts of the European Parliament are invited as well. Of course, if it comes to the comitology, there the regulation is in place, and there even Commission is under the management, I would put, under the control of the member states. So what I think would help a lot the transparency is to make sure that when we are, for example, talking about who should be these experts, that we would proceed very rigorously with the declaration of interest, that we would check their background if they are not in the conflict of interest, that if they are representing any associations, that they must be registered in the transparency register, and of course the result of their work must be publicly displayed in the form of minutes. You must be properly informed when such meetings are going to take place, so we would have the full information. We are trying to put together the register on expert groups and the register on comitology. I know the IT experts are working flat out on how to achieve it, and I hope that next year together we can launch it, and you will see that if that new tool works to your satisfaction.
Est-ce que vous voulez ajouter quelque chose?
Like to add something?
Complémentaire,
Yes, I have a follow-up question. I'm, of course, very interested in the answers you've just provided. We saw President Juncker speak on car emissions, and he said that he regretted the fact that he didn't support our idea for an independent European agency, and he said that we should be moving towards more European agencies. Do you think that we should fund completely independent expertise through new agencies on specific issues? Thank you.
Excusez-moi, s'il vous plaît, parce que...
I'm very sorry. Can you just repeat the first part of your question? When you talked about emissions, CO2 emissions and cars. At the beginning, there was no independent agencies, and the European Commission didn't support the idea of an agency. And President Juncker said that he regretted that he should have supported the setting up of an independent agency. Is this something that will come up later on, and will it be only about car emissions or other issues?
Really one of the very difficult files which I had together with my fellow commissioners on the table, because you're absolutely right, the Dieselgate was a little bit as a result of this very cozy relationship between the car manufacturing and testing authorities in the member states. And we have seen to what kind of dramatic proportion it has led, and how difficult it is to correct those mistakes, and how we are now doing everything possible to catch up with the new trends like electromobility. So in this case, I'm sure that if we would have independent agency for the emissions or for the road transport, it would be much better. The question is how the new Commission would approach it, and how we will put into the practice the new standards which we developed together.
Thank you. And now Markus Pieper, EPP, in ITRE Committee. You have the floor.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. Fortunately, the European Union is the driving force behind the Paris Agreement. And we are, again, the driving force for achieving the targets under the Paris Agreement. However, we have a lot of bureaucratic baggage weighing us down, and hence my questions. Firstly, the one in, one out principle. Clear question here. Will the European Commission commit to a binding principle to get that one in, one out implemented? Yes or no? You don't need to say any more than that. Second question is on the impact assessment. Is what is currently being discussed correct? Namely, that in the next 100 days, the European Commission would like to publish as much of that impact assessment as possible in order to get as much legislation going as possible. So are those discussions correct, or would you prefer to have a solid impact assessment process for citizens and business without any deficits in that process? Third question, impact assessments are all well and good, but they are always the Commission's impact assessments. And the Commission has a vested interest in ensuring that the impacts of its activities are seen as good. We have a scrutiny board which would make an independent impact assessment possible. What would your view be of beefing up that scrutiny board to an independent body as it is in the UK and Germany? Thank you.
Thank you very much for all three questions. If it comes one in, one out, what I want to say is that we are going to focus like the laser beam on administrative burden. Every new administrative burden should be offset by removing of administrative burden in outdated legislation. This is how we are going to do it. And I believe that this is the best way to approach it, because I think if we would approach it in a mechanical way, we can cause a lot of harm and damage. If it comes to the impact assessment, we clearly need even further to improve the quality and transparency. I know that there is now the discussion going on in the European Parliament how should be enlarged the principles and factors which should be properly assessed when the impact assessment is being done, and we are going to follow those recommendations and to make the impact assessment even more comprehensive and more future oriented. If it comes to the independence of the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, I'm sure that you are informed that that in the last period we have 3 external experts who are working in this Regulatory Scrutiny Board, and as a commissioner who was working on the Energy Union, I can tell you that these are pretty tough people. So if they see that something is not working, that something is really burdensome, that something is not really being properly assessed, they are not hesitating to block the whole process and to make sure that this would really correspond to the highest demands on the quality of legislation. And what I want to do is to support them from that, to improve their quality, to give them more resources to do their work even better, and to also use the potential of the joint research center on some of the issues where we would need more scientific evidence, where we would need more information gathering, so we can really be sure that the work we do is properly based on science. Sorry, my time is up.
It's okay.
Question, if I may.
10 seconds, please, not more.
Wir brauchen nicht.
We don't need 3 independent experts. We need 300 independent experts to do what the Commission wants to do in terms of its impact assessment. They need 300 to evaluate the Commission's proposal. Sorry to say that. Are you in favour of hiring more staff? And final question, are you really finally in favour of a binding SME test, particularly for middle-sized companies to be able to cope with bureaucracy, so really we can see the Commission taking steps to address that?
I got the point. I mean, the 2 very quick answers. Let's look how we can link our regulatory scrutiny board with the independent bodies in other member states and to compare the notes, because what we want in the end is legislation which is good, which is not cumbersome, and which is for the benefit of the European citizen and businesses. And if it comes to the SMEs test, this was something which was very much on the heart of the president-elect, and in our subsequent discussion, she was putting it as a very, very high priority that the SMEs are backbone of European economy. We should treat them well, and we should also bear in mind how our legislation is sometimes too complicated and too complex for a small and medium-sized enterprise. So yes, we are going to do it. We are going to use a special SME filter, and any ideas how we can do it together better, I would very much welcome it, and I'm ready to work with you on to make sure that our SME sector is satisfied with the new changes we are going to introduce.
Tiene ahora la palabra Iván García del Blanco.
The next speaker is Iván García del Blanco from the S&D Group, representing Jury.
You mentioned before artificial intelligence, and about this, the development of AI will most likely be linked to the refit better lawmaking agenda. Here, business argue intensely in favor of less regulation in order to allow for and boost the development of AI technology. As the main EU instruments governing artificial intelligence, today is the General Data Protection Regulation and the e-Privacy Directive, the latter being currently updated. It should be underlined that any initiatives from the Commission in this area have to fully respect and guarantee fundamental rights, such as the protection of privacy and personal data or non-discrimination. Due consideration should also be taken of the need to guarantee the respect of other ethical and human aspects and create trust in these new technologies. How will you ensure that initiatives in favour of facilitating artificial intelligence within various sectors does not undermine existing regulation or protection of fundamental rights, but rather uses the protections as competitive advantage?
Thank you very much, Mr. Garcia del Blanco, for this very foresightful question, I would say. And I'm sure that artificial intelligence would be the topic which we would have to discuss in a great depth and from all aspects, because currently we are really at the beginning. So what is artificial intelligence? This is or algorithm or machine which is able independently to observe the environment, adopt autonomous decision, communicate with each other, and then act. And of course, you can have this type of machines in all spheres of life, prescribing the medicine, doing medical work, being responsible for autonomous driving. And this is really touching the soul and hearts of our citizens. Who is liable for their action? Who is responsible if something is going wrong? Who is going to be in the possession of our private data? How our rights would be guaranteed? And here I think we have to 100% insist on our European approach to data, to our European approach to the IT. I heard that these big internet companies in the United States thrive also because they are in the possession of very precise data of 70% of the population. I'm not sure that Americans all know it. And we know that in Europe we are much more sensitive on if it comes to the privacy of data. We acknowledge that data is this new fuel of the economy of 21st century, but at the same time we have to make absolutely sure that our data are well protected, that our fundamental rights are respected, and that we know who is liable, who is responsible, and that humans must be always in control. So this would be one of the questions for the upcoming Commission, how we set the parameters that we would remain global leaders in this very important segment, and at the same time we do it in our European way.
García del Blanco, ¿pide añadir algo?
Would you like to add something?
In fact, you answered a bunch of interesting questions to my question. No? But in order to this, how you, concretely speaking, how do you intend to consult the Parliament in reshaping the platform that you announced, Fit for Future?
Thank you very much also for this question. When I was preparing for our hearing, I was, of course, discussing with our expert how the REFIT forum is working, and everybody agreed that it's a very good tool, it's a very important platform, and it helps in many respects. But also they felt as well that maybe we need to rebrand it, we have to bring something new, and we have to look also a little bit more into the future. So to connect it with the foresight and to make sure that once we are going to look again how we can retrofit the legislation, how to make it not only less burdensome but more future-oriented and better prepared for what the today's super dynamic world is bringing to us. So I think the first thing we would have to do is to look how to compose the people, the experts who would work on that Fit for the Future platform. And I would suggest that once we have these new proposals on the table, how I would like to do it, that I would come to your both committees. We can discuss it. I will be very interested to hear your advice and to build also political support for this new platform, because this is something what we have to, I would say in positive sense, sell well here, but also in our member states so that people would respect their suggestions.
Maintenant, Marie Toussaint du groupe des Verts.
Ms. Toussaint from the Greens group is the next speaker from the ITRE and AFCO committees.
Merci.
Thank you. I'm over here. Over here. Mr. Šefčovič, thank you very much for coming. Evidence-based policy making. Well, first of all, we need to protect the climate and the environment to make sure that we base ourselves upon science and on the basis of studies conducted in the general interest whilst respecting human rights. Now let me come back to Dieselgate and the European Court of Justice's decision on the non-disclosure of studies on glyphosate. You mentioned that these studies would be available on our website, and I wonder whether you could tell us whether or not you have committed yourself to making sure that these studies will be made public through all the European Union institutions, will be accessible so that they can be reviewed by the citizens of Europe.
Thank you very much, Madam, for being so precise, explicit, and also so concrete if it comes to the glyphosate case, because that's really one of the issue which even our treaties couldn't foresee at that time, that we have procedures in place where you put proposal on the table, and then you have the comitology discussion when you cannot get qualified majority, nor for authorization nor against authorization. And you have also the discussion in the Parliament, which is very much against these proposals, and also the public opinion in our member states is very diverse. So that's partially the political problem. It's also the problem of the evaluation of the scientific evidence which was provided by our agencies, and it's also the issue with which we would have to deal in the future. But I agree with you that what would be the most important at this case is to be as transparent as possible and to show the public and to you as the representatives and directly elected representatives of the European people what kind of scientific basis was there for that proposal. So if I succeed, I hope with your help in creating these joint registers for evidence which should be interinstitutional. So I would insist that all the evidence we used for our impact assessment, for the preparation of our proposals, should be included into this register, so everybody could have a look at it, it could be properly debated, and everybody would know where the Commission got the scientific evidence it's using for the legislative work.
Est-ce que vous voulez ajouter quelque chose? Allez-y.
Would you like to add something? Do go ahead. Could I pick up on this issue of transparency? I'd like to mention Council. Council is rather opaque, and when they have democratic questions put to them by the citizens, and they are not transparent, that rather adds fuel to the fire of the lack of trust. So I think it's important to increase transparency. The confidentiality that the Council imposes on its discussions and its documents and its votes means that citizens struggle to understand what the governments who represent them are saying on their behalves. It's important that we put paid to that secrecy culture. And as Commissioner, will you act to reform the rules that bind our three institutions together so that the Council does provide a level of transparency at least equal to that provided by Parliament? And if Council consists not to follow the recommendations by the European Ombudsperson, would you take this, and this would be taken to the courts, would you join the Parliament in following that procedure? Thank you very much for that question. I think it really does hit the nail on the head, and this is something we've discussed on many occasions. There's also case law that's been developed on this, and I think when it comes to these topics that will play in, there are also the decisions by the European Court of Justice, the Capitani case. So I think it is important that there should be a higher degree of transparency. The 4-column documents are so important for transparency and also for preparing trialogues. And in those cases where the Commission is asked for documents, in the case of trialogues, we have to always provide those documents. As to the Council on this, what I can do, and this is what I want to do, is appeal to the European Council to discuss this issue with the Ombudsperson, and I would be encouraged by the Finnish presidency in this, which has already experimented and has tried to be far more transparent in opening up Council documents to the general public. And I hope that the ensuing presidencies will carry on down that same road. Thank you.
And now, Joachim Kuss from ID Group, member of Juri AFCO committees. You have the floor.
Ja. Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much, Chair. Well, Mr. Šefčovič, we'll keep going. So the first time I went to a committee meeting in Brussels only a few months ago, then I had a shock. You know, people in that meeting were talking of the Council as of an enemy, i.e., I learned that the Parliament sees the Council not as an opponent but as an enemy, and that really surprised me. And in the meetings afterwards, then I noticed that the Parliament's attitude to the Council seems purely toxic, to be honest. And you can see that reflected in the fact that the Council's budget was not approved for the 9th time, the audit. So what measures will you take to improve the relationship between the Parliament and the Council? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kus, for your question. Of course, for the sake of European citizens and for the sake of bright European future, it's our duty to collaborate as well as possible among all institutions. And I'm sure that you know that I will represent the European Commission here in the European Parliament, and I'm sure that I will be frequent guest in the committees who are auditioning me today, but also in the conference of committee chairs or in any other occasions where you would feel that it's suitable that representative of the European Commission is there and is discussing you with the cooperation and the topics which will be on the agenda. I will equally represent the Commission in the General Affairs Council, which is preparing the European summits, which is dealing with horizontal issues like multi-annual financial framework, like enlargement, like cohesion policy, and many other topics which are of the great importance to you. So we, as a Commission, are always trying to find a way how to make sure that the cooperation between all three institutions, especially among the co-legislators, European Parliament and the Council, is as good as possible. And this is how we also approach the trilogues, where we invest enormous energy to make sure that the positions before the final negotiations are as close as possible, so we have a reasonable chance for success. So the official reply I should give to you, according to our experts from the Secretariat General, is that I should be equidistant from both institutions. But I do not like that word. I would like to be equally close to the European Parliament and to Council, because I believe that it helps to translate sometimes the grievances of the European Parliament towards the European Council, and again explain the Council's position to the European Parliament, so we can find the solution as we did with several interinstitutional agreements which we managed to sign when I was in this position for the first time.
Mr. Kos?
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And now, the more active today, Mr. Zambaski, member of ECR, member of the Juri Committee. You have the floor.
Thank you once again, Chair. Mr. Šefčovič, when talking about assessments, the institutional relationships are lacking the following question: the double standards. This is an issue pertaining to the Eastern and Middle Eastern European states. For example, the mobility package. We all talk about green energy here, but in this mobility package, it is envisaged that empty lorries to drive back millions of kilometers producing CO2 emissions in vain, just in order to accommodate the interests of the Western companies. And this puts the Eastern companies at a disadvantage. Now, this is a contradiction in terms. We are talking about green energy, and at the same time we are talking about reducing CO2. How are you going to resolve the problem and the conflict here?
Thank you very much for this question, and I have to say that, to the regret of current Transport Commissioner Madam Bulc and myself, this was the one file which remains pending. And I think because we didn't manage to find I would say that the overwhelming consensus which would really gather the majority of our member states and the members of the European Parliament around the best possible solution. And you know that what we've been discussing there was how many days our truck drivers would have for international international transport, how many days they can use for the cabotage, what are the rules for the weekly rest, daily rest, monthly rest, and so on and so forth. I think that in the end we got tied down to the great details, which made the final solution extremely complicated. And I think that we a little bit missed what was the initial idea when we've been proposing this proposal to get rid of the very often false letterbox companies, which been really putting very often the truck drivers into the enslaved conditions. That we've been omitting the situations where very often the not very reputable companies been taking unfair advantage of the truck drivers on another side and very often playing them against each other. So I think that what we need to do would be to get a fresh start, to have a look what we can do better for the future. How can we use the modern logistics? Because I think that what should be in our interest looking at climate change, how can we make sure that our truck business is much more efficient? How we can better combine it with the railways? And what can we do better that we would really be more efficient in spending and using diesel in our trucks, especially where they have no cargoes?
Okay.
And one additional question about the double standard. A big German company plans to transfer its production to Turkey. Within the European Union, we have an agreement on the level of state subsidy. Representatives of this company say that they go to Turkey because they can circumvent the subsidy rules. In Turkey, there are no such rules, but there are also no ecological standards, and let alone human rights and policy making. So what is going the Commission to do in this regard? This company, this German company, is not a private company. In this company, the Prime Minister of Saxony is participating.
Thank you very much for this question. I do not have the detailed information on these concrete companies, but I can, I believe, respond to you in a structural way, because the problem of state aid provided from the third countries to the businesses which operate in Europe is a little bit similar to what is happening where we are importing the goods from third countries with much higher carbon footprint than we are producing in Europe. And I think that we need to be much more forceful and assertive in our trade relations with third countries. We have to stop the practice that we would push, and rightly so, our companies to manufacture and produce cleanly, and then through public procurement to push, let's say, public authorities to import dirtily, meaning dirty products. We need to introduce the border adjustment tax, import car duty, which would put on a level playing field our companies in Europe with the competitors in the third countries where they do not respect the need to fight climate emergency.
Thank you very much. The next questioner is Mr. Jaar from the EPP and the Petty Committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Šefčovič. On behalf of the Petitions Committee, could I say that there's been a large number of petitions on environmental questions, pollution of the environment and projects that threaten the environment. I'd just like to touch on that aspect. How does the Commission deal with this? When you've got projects in the planning phase, the Commission tends to make the assumption that member states have abided by all European laws. Once the planning phase is over, the project gets underway and you can set up an amusement park in a nature area or national park quite quickly, and then the treaty infringement procedures turn out not to have teeth. So my question is, what are the instruments that the European Commission could bring to bear in such cases more upstream rather than once the projects have been built? And I wonder whether the treaty infringement proceedings could also take place at the planning stage.
Thank you very much for your question, Mr. Yar. And first, a couple of, I would say, structural points. I very much would like to establish high-quality relationship with your committee, because I'm fully aware how frustrating it is for you and for the petitioners if they do not get the answer on time, or if they get the answer which is purely bureaucratic and not satisfactory at all. So we have to work on it together, and I think the best approach would be to work on the petitions where we know that they kind of do not belong to our competencies, to be very honest and upfront and tell them this is not up to us, this is for somebody else. But in the areas where we have the competence, I think there we have to be more forceful. And I promise you that if you would have, like in this case, the questions clusters around the environmental permits or environmental studies, or I know that very often there is a number of questions concerning the airlines and how they're behaving toward the customers. Let's have a structural debate on these issues in your committees. Let's prepare properly the commissioner, the services, so you get the answer, and we get the answer to the citizen, and we start to deal with this issue. If it comes to the environmental studies, in Europe, every year we have, and I'm not exaggerating, like tens of thousands environmental assessments done on national, regional, city level. And therefore, I think we would need to find an appropriate way how to deal with those pertinent ones. I understand that it's not much use to enter into the discussions with the member states where, let's say, the building is already completed or the construction is already done, but how to focus on those where we know that there is something going wrong, that we should intervene and we should work together. Let's think about it, how can we do it and manage it with our resources.
Gestatten Sie eine Nachfrage?
Could I ask a supplementary question? The Petitions Committee bases itself on answers from the European Commission, and within 3 months, by the latest, after there has been an inquiry put to them, they must answer. I wonder whether you would try and help guarantee that these 3 months deadlines are upheld, because often the answer comes too late back to the Petitions Committee. And I wonder whether we could do a deal today that you'll guarantee that you'll keep to those deadlines here and now.
Let's make the deal that I'll do my best to get you the answer in 3 months. If you would help me to clear out all the questions for which you and I know that we are not responsible for, because they are not in our competencies. If we can sift through that and you will just send us really the petitions for which the Commission can do something and it's responsible for, I'll do my utmost that you will get the good answer at 3 months and you will have the commissioners ready to be in your committee. But I think we both would have to be honest with our citizens that if they are coming with the petitions with which there is nothing we could do, that we'll tell them immediately, so we would not frustrate them on having the petitions on the table for a long time, and then we tell them, sorry, we look at it, it's not up to us to take the decision, you have to go back to the national level. So if you can have this type of a deal, I'm very much ready to work with you, and I'm very much looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is from Lisa Scheinmacher from the Renew Europe Group and the Jury Committee.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the Commissioner to answer our questions. I would like to ask you about the Battery Alliance, which is mentioned in your mission letter. How will you ensure that the EU will be in the forefront of the development and production of the technologies of the future? We see the establishment of a Battery Alliance where you will coordinate the Commission's work. However, we do not know what will be the technologies of the future. So how will we form the alliances needed to make sure that the EU will be creating the innovative technologies and also produce them rather than importing them? Our industries do not have 5 years to wait for the next alliance following the battery alliance, especially not our innovative SMEs, which are the backbone and often the most innovative European industries. So how will you use the strategic foresight to keep the EU in the forefront of technology development? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam. A first couple of words about Battery Alliance and then how we can link it with our other strategic area. In the Battery Alliance, the most difficult part was to actually launch it, because we had to convince the leaders of the industry the diesel technology is technology of the past, and the future technology would be based on batteries and hydrogen. And we also had to demonstrate to them that battery, it's not a commodity, that it's actually a strategic part of the future cars, that battery and softwares would represent the 80% of the value of the car. And the Asian manufacturers do not want to export batteries to Europe. They want to export electric cars. So if you do not want to end up that some of the today high-end, very famous European trademarks would be electric, and that we would get the answer, if you want to buy them, you have to buy a made in China car, then we had to act very forcefully and make sure that we would catch up with our industry. What was then very important was that, that we have to use this window of opportunity, which is open for another 2-3 years, to demonstrate that we can actually massively produce the batteries and that they will be better than the Asian ones, that will be sustainable, greener, with the modern software, and that we would at the same time invest in the next generation of the batteries, so when the solid-state battery technology comes, that we'll be best at it. And I believe that that work of industry, policymaker, our regulatory power of the Commission, but also the financial support which we've been able to provide to these future innovative companies can be replicated also in other strategic areas. And for that, I would like to use these foresight responsibilities to come to you and tell you in which other strategic sectors we should do the same, establish such an industrial pact so we can really keep up pace with our major global competitors.
You have a follow-up?
Thank you. During the campaign prior to the elections, something that I heard very often from voters was, Brussels seems so far away. They are making regulation that we don't need. And we spoke about the one-in, one-out principle and how we will work towards the alleviation of overregulation. We have the SME test, which is a good development. But I was wondering, are you planning on visiting SMEs yourself in order to see what they are actually, what they need and how they are affected by European legislation?
Of course I will, and I, throughout my presence in Brussels, I very much valued the social dialogue, and I learned how much it was helpful where we've been introducing this new approach to the coal regions, how it was important when we've been discussing the difficult questions linked with transport, and you would be surprised, but the social partners would like to see me already in the next couple of days, and always they have also with them representatives of the SMEs. But I understand the message from all of you today that if we are going to look at administrative burden, that we have to be very intelligent, smart about it. We have to use the modern tools, e-government, digital means, and especially look how can we help to alleviate the burden, the SMEs. So any advice I can get from you, from them, let's have a look at it. And I would like to approach all member states and associations, if they could be very concrete. What is the concrete piece of legislation which is making your life difficult? let's work, let's give me 2 or 3 examples, let's work on it together so that people would have concrete results and we would learn how to do it in a way that SMEs would actually appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. The next question is from Mr. Castaldo from the Non-Aligned Group and from the AFCO Committee.
Grazie, Presidente. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Commissioner Designate, it's a pleasure to have you here for this hearing. The European institutions and policies have to be based on participatory democracy, guaranteeing the principles of full transparency and correct and timely information provided to citizens. I listened to your statement with great interest, especially when it comes to the Capitani case law and the ruling. But I would like to extend this on the basis of your answers to the written questions. You say you're committed to finishing interinstitutional procedures on the transparency register. Interinstitutional agreements can be binding for the institutions, but not for third parties. So I'd like to know how you're going to wrap up these negotiations, since there's resistance in the Council, and will there be a legislative proposal that will improve transparency and improve the democratic procedure? And if you are planning to do this, when exactly? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Castaldo. If it comes to the transparency register, I remember how we started with the renovation of the system which we had at that time, and I think it was like almost 8 or 9 years ago, and how we had to adjust the transparency register to the different kind of businesses, associations, NGOs, think tanks, and how we very much wanted to actually cover all spheres of life and all those who want to be part of the European policy debate and European legislative discussions. And I think that we succeeded with this. And today I think that transparency register is really a reference point if we compare any other country in the EU, in OECD, or United States. There is, of course, one issue where we would need to continue to our discussion, and again, I think it's a pending file from the current legislative period. How can we make the transparency register used even more for European Parliament, for the Council? I know that these are very sensitive issues where we have to find the proper balance. Also for you, because you are directly elected representatives of the people, and you have your rights, your prerogatives. So how we can really make sure that transparency register would play its role, knowing that also the members of the European Parliament take it very seriously when meeting people for the discussion. And the same applies to the Council. I think that if we achieve that all 3 institutions would have the same approach to the transparency register, we will do a great service to the European citizens, and we will really set, I would say, shining example to all democracies on this planet, how we transparently are dealing with the representatives of be it business interest or any other interest which they come to advocate when meeting with us. And I'm ready to work with you very, very closely. And I'm sorry I got so carried away on the transparency register that I didn't have time to answer on the Capitani question. If Mr. President allows, in the follow-up, I will elaborate on that. Excuse me.
Would you like to? Yes, follow up.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for committing to all of this. And I'd like to understand whether you're intending or not to present a regulation in order to tackle this. And then I'd like to continue along this theme to see whether there will be a constructive solution in order to push talks forward on other important issues, the right of inquiry, for example, for the European Parliament. We know that the Council hasn't been thrilled about this, And I'd like to know what your action is going to be, how you're going to steer the European Commission if there is controversy between the Parliament and the Council in this term as well. And then, of course, on the right to inquiry still, if the European Parliament decides to take this to the Court of Justice, what would your position be? And how would you see this proposal? Would you be willing to support us? Thank you.
I think that concluding on your first question, I think if it comes to the transparency register, I think what we need to do is complete this effort. It means to find a way how the European Parliament and the Council can be part of this effort, and I'm ready to engage myself fully, discuss it with you, and look for the best possible solution. If it comes to the right of inquiry, I mean, it's a pity that this is blocked since 2012. I mean, and it's long overdue because you have a full right to change the really outdated regulation on this matter. And I fully understand that you want to have all the powers necessary that you can follow the inquiry as the European Parliament. My suggestion would be, I'm going to organize the meeting with current and future presidencies. I am also ready to invite the coordinators of your committees for such a discussion, and let's have a look. Can we move it forward? Or really, are the differences so unbridgeable that we would be losing another 7 years since the proposal was tabled, or we are going to look for some kind of constructive compromise which would give you the right of inquiry as you rightly demand, and at the same time we will take care of different legal constraints which are presented mostly by legal services of the European of the Council.
Thank you. The next question comes from Mr. Pisapia from the S&D Group and the AFCO Committee.
Grazie. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your written answers, and thank you for your answers so far. I think it has clearly emerged that one of the priorities of this legislature is to find ways to harness the potential given by the treaties in order to speed up the decision-making procedure. The president-elect supports this, and she even said during a plenary session in Strasbourg that we have to move towards abolishing unanimity when it comes to climate, energy, social affairs and taxation. So therefore, my question to you is, as things stand at the moment, before being able to make changes and make sure that we are real co-lawmakers, do you agree with moving from special procedures to the ordinary majority and from unanimity to QMV? And in which sectors would you get rid of passerelle clauses, either the general clause or the sectoral ones? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pisapia, for this question. I think that this would really be the question for this Commission, because if we want to be a geopolitical Commission, we also have to have ability as a European Union to act much faster. And we have seen how very often it is difficult, especially in the area of foreign policy, where very often, for different reasons, one or two member states can really paralyze the whole action on the level of the European Union. And I know that here, of course, in many areas, maybe such a gradual build-up to move from unanimity to the QMV would help to speed up the decision-making process and would help to show that European Union is very agile and can adopt the decisions much faster. Even the idea which was raised by my colleague Josep Borrell of the constructive abstention could be a solution for many of the areas where we need the fast decision-making. Of course, the priorities of the Commission, as you have also seen from this first 100 days plan, are very much linked with the social affairs. The minimum wage, transparency of pay, of course the Green Deal and the artificial intelligence. I think that in this area, as well as in completing the European and Monetary Union, it would also benefit greatly if in these areas we would move gradually from the unanimity to the QMV. As you know, I was responsible for energy union, and again I would say it would be much easier if the energy taxation we would have that possibility to vote on some of the areas through the QMV. I know that for the member states setting of the rate is probably untouchable and they would like to keep that possibility, but discussing about what kind of taxes we are going to raise together through the more flexible decision making, I think should be only welcome.
Thank you. Mr. Pisapia, do you have a second, or is this?
Sì, brevemente.
Yes, briefly. I'm very pleased with your answer, which I find convincing, because the risk of this hearing is to be too general and not to get down to brass tacks. So I think it's extremely important to be specific in our action, not only in Europe, but in the rest of the world. And often this is something that is lacking in people who will play a very important role when it comes to the future of our planet and our continent. So I'd like to thank you very much for everything that you've done over the last few years for Europe and what you're doing now as a member of the current Commission. And as far as I'm concerned, I truly believe that we will continue working hand in hand in this term. Thank you.
Mr. President, allow me only to thank for the kind words to Mr. Pisapia, and I also appreciate a lot the support I have from the European Parliament for everything we did under the Energy Union, especially in the tackling the climate change. And I can tell you that having the chance, the honor and the privilege to sign on behalf of the European Union the Paris Agreement in New York, in the United Nations, was one of my proudest moments in my career, and I know how thankful I am to the European Parliament, but also to my colleagues in the Commission. So thank you very much for your kind words.
Thank you. The next question is from Mr. Sayer from the EPP Group and the Jury Committee.
Köszönöm szépen, tisztelt.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner Designate, one of the hottest issues in the European Union is concerns shared competences. The member states believe that the EU, there's a certain amount of Euro creep, taking competences from member states gradually, little by little, and the member states feel that they cannot act enough in these circumstances. I was listening to your answer when you said that there's a lot of member states that are not for a certain proposal, then you will not submit it. However, in the three cases when yellow card procedure was initiated, the Commission rejected this in all of these cases. Some people considered this an arrogant move on the Commission's side. How can you guarantee, because it's very difficult to have a common position from a number of parliaments. So how can you guarantee that the European Commission will take more into consideration the individual remarks from individual national parliaments, and only 1 out of 3 cases is the yellow card procedure successful?
Thank you very much, Mr. Sayer, for this question, and I think that the best reply or best approach how to handle the situation is more forthcoming attitude and more political approach. If it comes to the yellow card procedure, I think that currently the national parliaments are suffering in using this procedure from several angles. The first one is that very often they complain that this 8 weeks is a too short period of time. Therefore, hopefully with your tacit agreement, we for the first time are not going to count the end of the year holidays into this delay. and that we will be at the same time much more proactive in preparing what I would call aggregate answers. So there will be not, I would say, bureaucratic answer to each parliament, but when we see they have the same problem, they are coming to us with the same issue, let's have a little bit of a political approach and prepare the answer which is really responding to the issue the national parliaments put on the table. I hope that this would address some of the issues, and then I think what is very important is to invite more often representatives of the national parliaments over here to Brussels so they can meet the European colleagues, they can talk to the Commission, and also it's very important that we would travel as often as we can to the national parliaments to discuss the issues of their concern. I hope that we can benefit more from that report which was done by the special task force convened by the President Juncker, and I think that the concept of active subsidiarity, where we would coordinate with the national parliaments more upstream, would also help to alleviate that feeling that we are not taking them seriously enough.
Do you have a second question? Please keep it very brief.
Thank you. I would like to thank you for your answer. However, the minority needs to be protected in this case. You also come from Central Eastern Europe, just like I do, and in many cases, the effects of certain pieces of legislation are different and vary from member state to member state. We have heard about the mobility package. There's also the posting of workers directive. These were the cases when the Parliament activated the yellow card procedure, and just because effects of legislation vary from member state to member state, we really need to take into account the opinion of even a minority of member states. Commission has the rights of initiative. That's why it's very important when you are using your rights of initiative, you pay attention to the minority opinion, even if there's no orange or yellow card procedure active.
This I can very telegraphically answer that I very much value how the President-elect was very clear in addressing publicly, but also in private conversations. We have the issue of tension, let's call it East-West, North-South divide. And I think that also the composition of the Commission is reflecting how serious she is about making sure that we would be doing everything possible for Europe to be and to feel united again. And therefore, I agree with you that it's very difficult in a European Union to push something through if you have a staunch opposition from the important, even though it might be minority, number of the member states. Therefore, I think that what we have to do here, especially in such a sensitive questions, to meet, negotiate, discuss, rediscuss, and look for the solutions which are good for all of us, because in that case we end up with a solution which is lasting, which is supported, and which is really enhancing the European unity.
Thank you. The next question is from Madame Aubrey from the GUE Group and the Jury Committee.
Bonjour, je suis sur votre gauche. Oui, bonjour.
Hello, I'm over here. I'd like to come back to a topic that hasn't yet been raised in this hearing, and yet it's one of the things that has really hit the headlines. That obviously is scrutiny by the Parliament and the Legal Affairs Committee of the conflict of interests of the future European commissioners. And you'll no doubt know that our committee decided that for 2 commissioners there was a conflict of interest, and therefore they are not able to carry out their functions. You talked about a strong Parliament in your introduction, and thank you for saying that. What I have understood as this procedure has gone on is that it's been rather tempestuous, and I think it's been somewhat unpredictable. I don't think I'll be contradicted on that by those present, and it has been characterized by manifest difficulties rather restricted information, no possibility for there to be a proper investigation of the data, and at the end of it, a procedure which I think has really turned out to be somewhat political. And I think it has undermined citizens' confidence once again in the European Commission. Now, as Vice President for Institutional Relations, I wonder how you intend to put in place an independent authority. And when I ask my second question, I should be very short. And would you support the setting up of an independent scrutiny authority that would be given enough money and time so that they could scrutinise the commissioners designated before they came into office? Could I answer in question, if you don't mind, because it is a very sensitive topic and a legal one?
As you would understand, it's very difficult for me to comment on the situation and the situation so fresh, which also is linked with two of my colleagues, commissioners designate. And therefore, I understand that this is still the matter for the European Parliament, Jury Committee, with the President of the Parliament, and then, of course, with the President-elect. And I agree with you that this is the new situation, and it's quite clear that the Jury Committee took its right to clear our declaration of interest with a great interest in a great detail, and did it very, very thoroughly. I think that your second part of the question is very, very pertinent one, because I remember when we've been discussing the modernization of the staff regulation, and we've been introducing for the first time the code of conduct of commissioners. So one of the demands of the Parliament, upon which we agreed very quickly, was that we need the ethic committee, which would look into the matters of conflict of interest before, during, and also in the duties the commissioners would like to take upon themselves after the end of the active duty for the European Commission. And I think in the future, as also President-elect suggested, we would need this independent ethic authority. What I would suggest, though, basing on the previous experience, that it should be a body which would draw from the expertise of the people who know well our different institutions, which would have proper administrative support, that we do not have to wait very long time for the rulings, and of course, which would be composed of the people with impeccable backgrounds, and without any doubt they will do their job independently.
Thank you. If you have a supplementary, please keep it extremely short.
Thank you very much for that answer. It's really the wherewithal for that independence that I was interested in, so thank you for answering that. My second question goes back to what was said about the transparency of decisions in European Council. You were able to answer that, but I think there are member states that say one thing before the cameras and yet defend different positions in Council. And I'd like, quite apart from that, to bring to your attention the need for transparency in all European institutions. I'm thinking particularly about the Code of Conduct. It is one of the most obscure groups in the European institutional setup, but they do reign over important fiscal matters. So I think it's important to look at transparency across all of the European institutions.
Thank you very much for that invitation. I think that it's very obvious from our today's discussion that this is an issue which is very much on the heart of most of the members of the European Parliament who intervened in this hearing. I can promise you that I will take it up with the Council and also suggest how we can proceed. I think that the Finnish presidency was very forthcoming in many of the aspects how to enhance the transparency. I know that it's still not something with which you would be satisfied, and I know that it's already beyond the limit of some of the member states, so I very much appreciate this courageous attitude of the Finnish presidency, and what I would suggest would be to debate these issues with the next upcoming presidency, so we can start the debate and look for the solutions which would help us to find satisfactory solutions how to bring more transparency also to the Council.
The next question is from Mr. Hashsel from the S&D Group and the ITRE Committee.
Yeah, Chairman, thank you very much. I would put my question in Slovak.
Thank you. Well, Vice President, you've been given a new task of identifying new trends in innovative technologies, which will have a significant influence not only on our economy, but also on society. I'm thinking of electric mobility in particular, where Europe has to turn out not just to be competitive, but needs to be, in fact, a leading force for decarbonising transport as a whole. You are already, in fact, a leader in the European Battery Alliance. But what do you think that Europe needs to do? What's missing for Europe to become a world leader, not just in batteries, but in electric mobility more broadly? What do we need to do for electric vehicles to become a reality in Europe? And what can the Commission do for high-performance batteries to become a part of cars, or not just part of electric vehicles, but for us to produce them here in Europe? What's the missing link here for us to catch up with China and other countries who are ahead of us in this field, so that we can make use of that 2 to 3 year window of opportunity as you indicated? Thank you very much, Mr. Heischer, for that very, very current topic. I think that what we were missing in Europe 2 or 3 years ago was, in fact, the awareness that electric mobility is the trend of the future, and that it would be a threat to nuclear power if we were to increase electric mobility, and nuclear accounts for a lot of European GDP. That was our thinking then. But now we've managed to set up an industrial alliance where we have more than 200 companies working together who are working on all of the processes along the chain which are necessary for success. So whether it's exploiting natural resources or whether it's writing modern software, so that we make sure that electric vehicles don't just have electric motors, but they take full advantage of the opportunity of electric mobility, for example, by storing energy and then selling it on later. We want the batteries that Europe will produce to be the cleanest and most efficient in the world. So we want them to be easily recyclable and easily reusable for industrial purposes or for people's domestic circumstances. That's what we're facing. And what's missing is achieving that goal, of the greenest battery and for the European produced battery. That's our aim, but what's missing is that we write that goal down in legislation and set up very clear goals that if we want electric vehicles in Europe, then we need to maintain those high standards which will support the green industry, that green target, those good batteries which will be made here in Europe. Now, of course, that isn't an investment, but you can see that over 100 billion euros have been invested over the past 2 years, so I'm not so scared as I was 2 years ago about our success. Thank you. Well, I'd like to ask a follow-up. That transition may be painful, certainly to start with, and therefore I'd like to ask you what you want to do in the European Commission. How do you want to anticipate and deal with people's potential fears about the energy tradition, using new energy sources? I mean, people might be scared of using their jobs in the coal mining industry, or people might be scared of losing their cars. What do you want to do to make that transition as painless as possible? Because that's really important for us at the S&D Group. How do you want to ease that transition, and what specific policies might you be interested in to make that transition painless? Thank you. Thank you very much for that follow-up. And the reason I'm so grateful to you is that the success that you have achieved as the Parliament, together with us, the Commission, is that we have managed to get a lot done in coal mining regions, and that, in fact, we're looking at those regions with fresh eyes. It's thanks to you that in the coming financial period, we'll have a just transition plan for those regions. I think that's a real success because just 2 or 3 years ago that was unimaginable. Now, I'm taking the European Battery Alliance as an example. I think we could use that as an example of how we could proceed in other strategic areas where Europe needs to be really strong. You know, how can we prepare coal mining regions for a new economic future? How can we explain that they need to create new industries in those regions? Well, they need to do that, in fact, in those same areas which are gradually growing obsolete, and it's becoming evident that we'll need new skills for workers in those sectors.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Mr. Šefčovič from the Green Party and the Petty Committee.
Here. Mr. Vice President, as an expert on foresight, you already know what I'm going to say. Since nothing can surprise you, you must have a relaxing life. I envy you. I don't even know what I will have for dinner. What will I have? This suspense is killing me. Foresight, could you please just tell us what you have accomplished by 2024 regarding the unhealthy relationship between the Citizens Committee, which is the Petitions Committee, and the Commission? It seems like you have been ghosting us. Will you have started a couples therapy? Regarding second, how you managed to grant Parliament the right to initiate legislation, and 3, regarding your job, making sure that all commissioners are clear of conflict of interests, including any presidents who may have close relationships with consultancies.
Thank you very much, Mr. Šefčovič, for this question. You're right. When I got the portfolio for foresight, it's true that some of my colleagues have been asking me if I can now tell them what would be the next lotto numbers. And I can tell you that I do not have that power, and that foresight really is not about the crystal ball. It's about making sure that we would use the best scientific advice in looking where the Europe could be, should be, or want to be it in 2030 or 2040, or how to get to what is so important for this House, to the climate neutrality by 2050. And then I think that science can give us very good advice. Will we get there if we would continue with the current policies? Probably not. Will we get there if we improve our efforts a little bit? Probably not either. So what we have to do that actually that preferred scenario would become reality, and how we would evolve from that goal, all the necessary steps in the economic sphere, in legislation, in regulatory area, so actually we can not only dream, but build the better future for all of us. That's foresight, and therefore I think we need to discuss it here in the European Parliament, how we are going to not only present the future, but work on it, and which means and through which megatrends we want to get there. So that, I believe, should be our common goal. And where we will be with the Petty and Commission, I don't think we would need the couple therapy, because usually when you have problems in a couple, the problem is communication. And I can assure you that I will talk to the Petty Committee as often as you would like me to be there, and I would encourage my colleagues from the Commission to do the same and to answer citizens' proper questions. And on right of initiative, I think I already elaborated, and I think that the Juri Committee proved today that if it comes to the conflict of interest, you are pretty tough, and you do not hesitate to use your powers. So I'm not afraid of that at all.
Your mission letter says that you're responsible for the dialogue between the people and the Commission, but what you intend to do is a monologue. So if you want people to care about what Europe is doing, you have to give them a say in what Europe is doing. To borrow from the consultancy speak that shapes your worldview, there is a huge human capital to be unleashed, and there are Europeans who know more than you, who care more than you, who are more creative than you, and who would do your work for less money. Looking back into your crystal ball, what exactly did you do to give them power?
I think that together we did a lot I think that if I have to look at my performance over the last 10 years, I think that I was probably one of the most frequent interlocutor with our citizens in the citizens' dialogue, and probably I visited the most European Parliament and regional councils that other commissioners, not because I'm that good, but because I was here longer and it was part of my job. And now the good thing is that our President-elect wants all of us to do the same. She wants us to visit all member states within the first half of the mandate. And of course, we are not going only to talk to the ministers or the parliaments. We want to talk to the people. And I would appreciate any concrete suggestions you might have how we can improve it. We are consulting the people through the platform Have Your Say. I know that it's not ideal. We are trying to interact with them through the social media. I was testing different ways how we used the Facebook platform to talk to the young people, and I was myself surprised that one discussion like that brought us 30,000 young viewers. So let's be creative, and I'm sure that the young people would be able to tell us how to do it better, and we are ready to listen and learn.
Thank you. The next question comes from Mr. Guren from the RE Group and the AFCO Committee.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I have the following question for the Commissioner designate. I'd like to talk about shared competences. Shared competences in the sense that we're talking about a policy that the EU isn't exclusively responsible for, so where the member states can also have a say. We want the EU to be very effective, and the treaty gives it that possibility through coordination, which is in the Lisbon Treaty. I'd like to give you an example: development aid. Official development aid. This is a promise that's been there for 50 years. We renew that promise at international conferences, and the member states agree within the Council on a specific goal, 0.7% of GDP for ODA, but we never honor this pledge. Only 4 member states honor this promise. I'm sorry, there's a problem somewhere. Are you just going to witness this continuing, or are you going to make sure that the member states assume more responsibility? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question, and also for the very concrete example you brought into our discussion. You are right that very often the ambitions presented in the room and at the press conferences from the side of the member states are much higher than the final outcome and then the concrete result. That's a political reality, and therefore we need to do much more in our mutual cooperation. The constructive pressure from the European Parliament, but also what I see, especially among the member states, the increased peer pressure on delivering on the said and stated commitments. And also, I think that from the side of the Commission, we also should do more to help the member states to achieve the stated goal. Very often when we talk about the problems in implementing of the EU law, sometimes it's just mismanagement, maladministration. Very often it's just lack of administrative capacity, or let's say not proper understanding of what needs to be done. So let's look at it. What is the real reason? What is the problem? And how can we help also the member states to be properly equipped to deliver on the commitment they made? And then on concrete example of the development aid, I think this would be one of the crucial questions for this Commission. And I know that my colleague, Madam Urpilainen, who would be responsible for the development aid, will definitely work very closely with you and would look how can we maybe overcome that gap which is still there for the development aid between commitments of the member state and results, how we can use the lessons learned from the Juncker Investment Fund and transform the external investment fund in something which would be of strategic importance and which can bring more than 40 billion of euros for the good projects in Africa, which I believe this continent needs and Europe is able to provide.
Thank you. I really want to insist on the fact that it is about common sense, but if we just think about common sense and trying to convince people, it's not enough. In other areas, it works. The EU has found, in the case of a treaty, a way to get the ministers responsible for the national budget to come and speak to the committee and to be held accountable to the committee who's responsible for that in the European Parliament, to be held accountable for what they've done or haven't done. So I think if we can do it for one policy, we can do it for another. And we should come up with a mechanism to make sure that the development ministers can come before the development committee in the European Parliament and be held accountable for what they haven't done. The current system does not deliver results.
Thank you very much for that suggestion and for that idea. I think that it would be very useful to have more intense contacts between the ministers who are responsible for development aid and also the European Parliament, because I believe that we would understand each other and this would increase not only the peer pressure but also democratic pressure on those countries which took the commitment and didn't deliver on it. And it would also create the possibility for the Commission to work with the Member States to use also other means for delivering the proper financial support to development countries than just the budgetary means coming from the Member States. Leveraging, using the European Investment Bank, which part of this should be transformed in the Climate Bank for the projects which would really help the development countries to develop much faster and much better to the benefit of their citizens.
Thank you. Our final question this afternoon comes from Mr. Rangel from the EPP and the AFCO committee. Thank you.
Commissioner designate Vice President, let me welcome you warmly and let me keep the scrutiny and the hard issues till the very last question. After reading your written answers and hearing your answers here today, one would be led to believe that you will be the Vice President for the interinstitutional relations rather than for the foresight portfolio. I truly hope you become a bit more ambitious. Otherwise, I think you will end as a hypothetical Vice President for interinstitutional relations and status quo instead of foresight. So let's be more ambitious. You have already said that the framework agreement that we both negotiated in 2010 should include the Council. But what concrete steps do you intend to take? And on substance, what do you think that should be changed? Council is steadily becoming an upper parliamentarian chamber. Should Parliament not have more access to preparatory meetings of the Council? Should not have further access to documents?
Thank you.
To stick to the time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rangel, not only for this question, which I think will clearly increase the ambition of my performance for the future, but also for the enormous help, advice, and assistance I was getting from you during these very difficult negotiations we had on the framework agreement. And I remember very well how both of us been appealing to the Council to join us in the framework agreement. And we know that it would be much better to have this more balanced approach in the way how we been Lisbonizing our daily lives, operations, work of the Parliament, of the Commission, and of the Council. At that time, it was not possible, mostly because of different legal concerns on the side of the Council. But since that, a lot has happened. I'm very pleased that we managed to have the trilateral agreement on better lawmaking. I'm also very glad that each year we managed to get the joint declaration about the strategic steps for the next annual period upon which we have to focus. And I think that the system, despite the fact that it's relatively new, is working quite better. So my suggestion to you and to the Council will be, let's look how the framework agreement was applied. Let's, I think, clearly conclude that by practice, we have proved that in no way it's infringing upon the Lisbon Treaty, because I'm sure otherwise it would be tested in the court. And how to make it useful for all of us and convince the Council that once we will be having such a clear-cut relationship between us, that we will definitely benefit from more efficiency, from better relationships. So I'm ready to take the challenge and to talk to the presidencies, and I can clearly make it one of the points when, for the first time, when I will get hopefully your approval, I will have a chance to appear in the General Affairs Council, because we need closer cooperation, especially where we are now talking about annual, multi-annual programming and strategic debates which we want to have together.
Another question related with your responsibility of our relation Parliament Commission. It is sometimes noticeable that members of the Commission, not only, but especially when they speak on behalf of other commissioners' portfolio, they present their opening statement with a prepared speech, but also, at the end of the debate, they have a closing statement that appears to have been drafted before the debate started. So, do you think that is appropriate in view of the Commission's accountability to Parliament, of the Commission's public image, and of the contributions to the debate by members of the European Parliament? Do you think that this is appropriate? And if it is not, how do you think that the situation can be remediated?
I have to admit that you are right. And it's true, when we especially are taking the file for our colleague on the last minute, it's true, we get opening remarks and then also we get the suggested closing remarks. And of course it very much depends how much time the Commissioner has to master the file, which is new for him or her. And I think that there is also another element, and I think what you look for is to show the respect to the members of the Parliament, that we listen to you, that you made a suggestion, that we take the note and we elaborate and react to your concrete suggestion in a debate in our closing remarks, because what you want us to do is to bring some of the suggestions you made in the debate back to the institutions and work with them. So this is something what clearly we as a commissioners have to improve. And if I may have one suggestion, it would help us a lot if we know a little bit more in advance which one of us is going to the plenary. It would be a great help, and I know that this is in your hand, and if you can do that, I can assure you that everybody would very much appreciate it. Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much for your question and for all of the questions, which I think have been excellent. I will now hand over to Vice President-designate Šefčovič for a 5-minute closing speech. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I will try to learn from the last intervention of Mr. Angel, and I will really react only to the interventions which you made in this debate. The first and foremost, I really would like to tell you that also this discussion confirmed how important the relationship between the European Parliament and the Commission is. And many of the suggestions you made today in our debate, but also in our preparatory meetings, are for me very important source of inspiration for the future work. I'm very encouraged by your attitude to bringing new methods, new technologies, new approach to how we legislate, how we cooperate, and how we deliver concrete results to our citizens. And I think that we have to do our utmost, because I am absolutely sure that the next years would really decide the destiny of Europe for many decades to come. The decision we'll take in the next 5 years would clearly mark the place of Europe not only in the world of 2030, but for the rest of the century. And I believe that all we want Europe to be cleaner, greener, more performant, more close to our citizens, and playing this very important role in the global affairs. When you travel outside of Europe, what you hear are not only the compliments, how the European countries can work together, but also the plea, please Europeans, be even more influential than you are now, because the world of today needs Europe, because we respect human rights, because we respect nature, because we respect international law, because we are trying to be as responsible as possible towards developing countries, because we are ready to share, we are ready to contribute, and thanks to these qualities, Europe is best place to live on this earth. So I believe that our joint mission is to be strategical, but also to be very concrete, to be very responsive, and to be very agile and active towards our citizens. I believe that if I will get your vote, and if you'll give me the chance, it would be my pleasure to work on all these issues and all these areas with you, so we can deliver this very ambitious agenda to our citizens. Thank you very much for all your excellent questions, and I also would like to thank for very gentle but strict chairing from the side of our two committee chairs. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Jury Committee, I would like to thank you very much, Vice President Designate, for some really thorough answers to our questions. You've listened very carefully to what people have to say. There are clearly a huge number of topics of interest that have been raised today. I think the one-in, one-out policy is clearly something that there's going to be a great deal of interest in, along with the foresight portfolio and how that can be used to really ensure that we have true evidence-based policy making, which I think is something that is going to be enormously important to make sure that we can use technology effectively and ethically in the future. So I'd like to thank you very much indeed for your very thorough answers to our questions and for attending here to talk to us today. And I'll hand over to President Tajani.
I would also like to echo the words of thanks the jury chair, and thank you very much for showing such a great interest in the European Parliament. You've proved it in the past. I am fully aware of how much you achieved when we were commissioners together, and I know how much you achieved in the previous term, and that you hold the European Parliament in high esteem. Unfortunately, not all commissioners have had the same attitude in the past. Sometimes some commissioners have been very disdainful, giving the impression that it was a huge sacrifice to come and meet the European Parliament. So you have answered all our questions very specifically. You've promised to go to committee meetings if invited, but you are not a commissioner like any others. You are a commission vice president. So, of course, we would like you to carry out your work as an interlocutor with the European Parliament as well as possible, but also to do your job as a Commission Vice President and explain to all commissioners, especially the new ones, how important it is for institutions to work hand in glove. It is our duty to scrutinize the work that you are doing in order to provide better answers to our citizens. I know you for many years, so I'm asking you to really carry out that vice presidential role vis-à-vis your colleagues so that they can really show a great sensitivity to this issue like you have. Relations with the European Parliament are vital. Often it's extremely important to defend the European Parliament when there is a tug of war with the Council. More often, or rather very often, the Council protects national interests, but doesn't really assume a European responsibility, and we are politically weak in an era of globalization if we don't stand united. Of course, there are different national sensitivities, but the European Commission and the European Parliament are the more community-oriented institutions. We have to try and explain this to the Council. I'm thinking about the Dublin reform. There's a stalemate in the Council. So it is this joint action that has to be crowned with success to bring about a more competitive Europe that is in a better position to protect citizens' interests. So we count on your work, and I am sure that, as you have done in the past, you have also done this over the next 5 years. Thank you very much for answering all our questions, and let me say that there will be a joint coordinators meeting in order to evaluate the hearing, and that will take place at 6:30 in camera. And we will therefore, when I say a joint coordinators meeting, it's AFCO and Jury, and those committees that are also allowed to take part in the debate. So the associated committees will be meeting separately, and after all of this, we will be drafting our letter giving our opinion on Mr. Šefčovič. I wish